In this episode, we take a look at the 2016 documentary entitled I Am Not Your Negro, which features commentary and work from one of America's intellectual giants, James Baldwin. And it also features Baldwin quite prominently as well in terms of archival footage. And in part two, we're going to consider the paradoxical way that American society approaches the idea of stay-at-home parenting. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me today is a man who's at his best when he podcasts at a very deliberate pace. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, you ready to take this nice and slow?
Only when it's deliberate.
All right.
If it's accidental, it's going to be fast and slow. That's for another show, I guess.
All right. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I'd ask that you please hit subscribe on your podcast platform or on YouTube. Like it, and that really helps us get in front of more people. Now, we're recording this on February 13th, 2024. And Tunde, although James Baldwin passed away in 1987, Raoul Peck's documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, did a great job of bringing some of Baldwin's writing and commentary to us in a way that really showed how relevant this stuff still was, today in American culture. So we're not going to cover the entire video, but the first thing from the video I wanted to hit today were Baldwin's thoughts on America's heroes and, how who America's heroes were and how they approached things and how he saw himself either fit into that or more prominently fit out of that. So what were your thoughts? What stood out to you in that, in terms of his thoughts on America's heroes and what America really holds on a pedestal?
Let me just say this, that documentary was profound. And to your point, it was made in 2016. It's absolutely relevant today. And it appears to me to be relevant throughout the story of American history. And I would say this with a smile, let's hope it's less relevant in the future, in decades to come for future generations. But to answer specifically on the part where he discusses America's heroes, that was interesting. It was profound for me because it was the first time that I looked at my own experience as a child in our country, in our culture, and the way James Baldwin, especially for the listeners who may not be and viewers who may not be as familiar, is he's extremely eloquent. So the way he speaks sometimes just allows your mind to actually visualize certain things. And so what he said when he was what he realized as a child when he was watching, the Lone Ranger, and I'm thinking about movies like John Wayne and the old Westerns. And this is what I related to is when I was a little boy, 5, 6, 7 years old, I thought all that not only was cool, but I thought that I was also on the side of the good guys, meaning the cowboy or the Lone Ranger type.
Yeah, the hero.
Yeah, the hero. And, as we know now as adults, in accordance with the culture of things like Manifest Destiny and the way that some Americans view their right or their ability to go ahead and dominate others on this land, let's say, what he spoke to is at some point realizing that they were actually coming after the people like him, and meaning the Lone Ranger or the cowboys, right? It was. And I think that's something that he said and I hate to talk like this, right? But it's true. Like for all non-white American kids growing up here, at some point you realize that the story about the heroes in American history generally do not include people that look like you.
Yeah.
And that's a narrative that I realized as I'm preparing for the day. I was reminded when I thought about John Wayne, about when we did the show about Black cowboys, and that at the late 1800s, about 25% of all cowboys were Black. And then the facts that have come out that the Lone Ranger character was based on a Black lawman from 1848 named Bass Reeves. So again, it kind of reminds me of this constant influx of mixed emotions and confusions that we have as Americans, where you and I were born and grew up in a time where the American culture had been indoctrinated to erase people like us out of the story historically. But when you look at the story of American history, actually, we're included in there. And so this is the battle we're fighting today with all the textbooks in school and that talks about CRT and all that, is who's going to control the narrative of this country's history. And I think that's what Baldwin, I think, eloquently pointed out when he talked about America's heroes.
Well, yeah, he talked about how it's a shock to the system in terms of where you now, and again, I thought you did a good job of kind of laying the groundwork for that, like where you fit in. Do you have a place in this society? And I was really interested in the way he described the behaviors. And so, he looked at, and he said this specifically, he didn't look at someone like Uncle Tom as a hero, and, from the stories of, Uncle Tom's Cabin and so forth, but just Uncle Tom, he didn't look at that person as a hero because that person didn't take vengeance in his own hands. What he admired about the heroes, America's heroes, was that they took vengeance in their own hands and that they behaved as if vengeance was theirs to take. And what he realized is that kind of mindset and behavior, though, in American culture wasn't acceptable by people that looked like him, James Baldwin being a black man. Like that, if a black person says, give me liberty or give me death, that's seen as a threat. He's seen as a criminal in terms of the overall larger society. And so I thought that was really insightful in terms of this, and in putting it and showing the contrast from when he viewed it as a child versus what he realized as he got older. He shows how this creates this discomfort within a person, saying, okay, well, you grew up thinking one way, and if it's presented to you in one way, and then you later on realize, like, well, hold on, this actually isn't really talking about me, or this isn't really something that if I emulate this, become heroic, then I'm not going to be treated as a hero. I'm going to be treated as a villain or as someone who needs to be put down and so forth. So I thought that it was just very insightful in kind of the insidious way that the culture that we're in can kind of creep in and change how you or affect how you view yourself. And, and so that's looking at it, from James Baldwin, a black man looking at himself as a black man. And, he even talked about how, and this is, a point that's been made, but just, you're born, you see certain faces and so forth. And like, in this culture, exactly, where do you see where you fit in? And when you do see that, do you see yourself fit in as part of the positive aspects of the culture or part of the negative aspects, the persecuted aspects of the culture?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting we landed on something similar as we were preparing without talking about it, because I actually wrote down that quote that he mentioned about vengeance. He says, quote, "Theirs was vengeance to take, and I understood that. My countrymen were my enemy." And I found that pretty profound, especially back then. I mean, I want to be very clear for anyone watching and listening now. I'm not, and I'm going to speak for you here, we're not advocating that white Americans are our enemy or anything like that.
But neither was Baldwin, actually.
Well,
I think it's worth saying. It's worth saying. Definitely what you're saying is worth saying.
Well,
but it's also worth saying that he wasn't saying this in a position. He was talking about, again, like an introspective aspect, like the process you go to. Like he specifically said that he's not he didn't want to go with the Black Panthers because he didn't think white people were devils.
I know, but I think it's important to point out just the historical time and the difference. Meaning, he was born during the height of Jim Crow segregation in 1924. I mean, this is when the country really went backwards from the whole Reconstruction. I mean, that's a generation after, that period of time, right? And here's a man who was the grandson of a slave. So again, this is James Baldwin will be 100 years old today, or if he was alive this year. And so it tells us how close we are still to this history, that technically someone else who's 100 years old today, which there are people alive that are that old in our society, may have been the grandsons or granddaughters of slaves or slave owners. And we have a lot of this still existing.
But more particularly to his perspective on this, he came of age in a time during where the civil rights movement was picking up. So coming of age during that time, he's literally seeing people say, hey, give me voting rights or give me the opportunity to go to the legitimate schools, and them being targeted for murder or brutality or arrested and everything like that. And so in his perspective, he saw people standing up saying, give me liberty, not even trying to take vengeance, but just saying, hey, recognize me, and them being treated as a criminal. And so from his perspective, that was what he saw. And go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, so you can understand where he's coming from without saying, okay, well, that's exactly where we are now. You can see the echoes of that, but it's not necessarily to say that this perspective is the only perspective, but it's an insightful perspective. And that's why, I wanted to make sure we touched on this. I do want to keep this moving. You had one more thing?
Well, no, because I think on your point about the you said this before many different times in different ways, people seem to judge the actors and not the actions. And that's why I say it's so apropos to our culture today and our inability to deal with just ourselves as Americans together, right? This racial history, this cultural history. So what I'm getting at is you say it right. If Black Americans say, give me liberty or give me death, that's seen as a direct threat by many white Americans. And that's a shame, because we're all in this together. So that's why I say, if you fast forward from his era to 2020, it was a good contrast where in the summer of 2020, we had the BLM marches and that kind of energy. And half the country responded hostilely to that and was very fearful and scared. Then 6 months later, on January 6th, we have then energy from kind of the other side of the culture, right? The kind of anxiety of the white American because of how the country's changed and being led by leaders who are telling them how bad that is and pushing things like the great replacement theory and fears like that. And so that's why I say, we're in the height of this right now, and what Baldwin and what the this part of the documentary and this conversation, he really brought it out in a way that, again, I only feel that one can deny this if they really just don't want to see it, and because this is part of who we are as Americans, it's undeniable.
Yeah, and it's been a part, of who we are as Americans. That's part of the American culture. And Baldwin, one of his defining kind of thoughts is that how Americans deal with these issues ultimately and over the course of time will determine America's ultimate trajectory and where America ends up, because there's this dissonance that's involved in a lot of the principles that we hold dear, and in terms of how we want to behave, how we see ourselves versus how we actually behave. And so until that can be resolved in a way, it can't be resolved perpetually based on delusion. And so, but again, to keep us moving, I don't want to get too bogged down in that, because again, the documentary is something we definitely recommend you see. It's really, this is more just commenting on aspects of it that really stood out and how that may connect to either historical United States or America, United States in today's era. One thing that Baldwin also discussed, and kind of along the same lines of how, these cultural aspects are going to define in many respects America's ultimate trajectory, was how hate, and then the documentary did a great job of showing a lot of images of, real images from the time period of how hate was such a big part of America. When you're talking about school segregation and people saying, demonstrating, putting it on the line to maintain segregation, and so forth. But how hate affects the hater. And I want to know kind of just your reaction to that in terms of the way Baldwin articulated, or just more generally on, how that affects American culture, because American culture does have elements of it that are defined in many respects by hate for other Americans.
Yeah, this is where it really gets fascinating in terms of the irrationality of all of it and what makes it so human. Obviously, as Americans, we're not unique to having, culture wars and racism and xenophobia and sexism or whatever you want to isms and the way people will divide themselves. Right. We've seen this in world history time and again. But I think America is special. I don't know about unique, because I don't know every other country's founding stuff, but we're special in the sense that we have these two competing kind of realities, right? We have this idea of the Bill of Rights, all men are created equal, we the people, that kind of stuff. And then we do have a history of white supremacy. And I don't say that as an attack on anyone. I say that with legitimate historical reference, right? We've talked about all this stuff. Look at Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech. Yeah.
To be honest, if someone receives that as an attack, I think that says more about them than anything. Because that's as you're
unfortunately,
saying,
we have a lot of fellow Americans that I'm sure would be, if they saw this, would be very offended by this conversation.
Well, but and that's actually a part of where we're going with this, though. Is that? Exactly. But go ahead. Yeah.
But so that's what I'm saying is that the one side is the beauty of the founding fathers' ideas, their words, the Constitution, the idea that we all are in a society that was an experiment from those escaping persecution in Europe from monarchs and authoritarians and an authoritarian religious state, which was the Vatican and the Catholic Church, which suppressed religious refugees that came here, so on and so forth. So we have like that one side of our history, which is beautiful and awesome, right? This was a land of people that wanted to do something for themselves and have a better life and have freedom of religion and freedom of thought. But we can't forget that they did that on the back of clearing out the indigenous people that were here. And then, as I use the term, harvesting Africans from Africa to come here and work as slaves. And Baldwin's documentary did a good job of alluding to the fact that there were a lot of white slaves, too, at the beginning of the colonization. Because remember, before Australia, England actually sent a lot of its undesirables here to the United States, and they were either slaves or indentured servants. So again, we don't get that history a lot. So the idea is that somewhere along the history, there was this fragmentation where there's a group of Americans that believed that their ancestors were given this land, and the rest of us weren't really invited in. We were brought in for certain services and to do things, but we're not really part of the actual fabric of this country. And then there's, again, the other part of our culture, which is the Bill of Rights and saying that, no, all men are created equal and all that. And that brings in all these other conversations, including like, are you and I considered men, as part of that discussion. So again, until we really sit down as adults and have this conversation as Americans and get past it, then, I see this happening every generation or two, that these things flare up.
Well, and I think the issue is that everyone's not like in past times. I think people were more open in terms of where they stood on this. Like right now, everyone for the most part seems to hold up something like the Constitution or the Bill of Rights and say, yeah, we're all in on this. In the past, it was easier to see the people who said, no. This is only for certain people, because they would say it out loud. They would say what they mean when they're in politics or wherever they were. But beyond that, the thing that I think that Baldwin's most insightful piece on this was how the effort it takes to deny the humanity, in this case to blacks, for portions of the American public, the effort it takes for them to deny the humanity of blacks turns them. They have to. It doesn't turn them. They have to turn themselves into what ultimately is a moral monster. You extrapolate that out from that, and that it becomes hard then within your, if you're going to turn off and say, okay, it's okay to take this person, in my land of law, rule of law and all that stuff, I'm going to take this person, go up to their house and kill them, or I'm going to go take them and I'm going to get a crowd together and we're going to hang them from a tree. To the ability to turn off a sense of morality towards that, it becomes difficult to toggle that back on and off, in other areas of your life. And so basically what you have, like the hater, the person who is going to build out their world, their reality on the idea that we're going to segment it. Okay, well, here is where we're going to have compassion. Here's where we're going to employ brutality, without any force. Those are hard barriers to keep in one's own mind and kind of just in their own system. And so what you end up seeing is that in other aspects of American culture, sometimes we have become we become closed off to the suffering of others, to the suffering of others that are in close proximity to us. And one of the ways this stands out to me is that in many countries around the world, that wealthy countries around the world, they're able to deal with issues that they have, collective issues that they have, whether it be healthcare, whether it be all these other types of things. They're able to discuss them and deal with them in ways that aren't just, let's just let everybody go and people die on the street, then fine type of thing. And in America, we're very well able to turn a blind eye to the hurt and suffering of others, even if like even in situations where it wouldn't cost us more money to try to address the harm and suffering that other people are going through, even if it's not costing us more money, we can ideologically say, nah, we're just not going to do that. Even if it costs us less than what we're paying now. And so to me, it's a really interesting thing to where, like, okay, if part of my defining kind of approach, defining ideology is about denying humanity to some others, that doesn't just stay siloed in that one piece. It starts to pull out in other areas. And so to me, I was just blown away by that as an observation.
Yeah, well, now you're sounding like some squishy dude trying to remind everybody that it's their fault for someone else's suffering, and you're not.
I'm
you're not going to be welcome to the dinner party. Come on,
I'm looking at this in the abstract more than anything, because like that is something that it you ask yourself, like, well, why does America spend more on healthcare than anyone else and get middling results compared to everyone else? Like, that doesn't seem right. That's like, hey, if we spend more on something, you would think we get better results, but the way we spend it isn't designed really to give the good results, because we're able to kind of turn off our minds and say, okay, yeah, we're fine. We'll spend, we're fine with the money being spent, but we don't actually want to address the problem. And that is mind boggling to me.
Well, I mean, I think, there's a lot going on there, right? Because I think one of the great unfortunate things that's come out of this, and again, we see it kind of creep up from time to time, is the way that, I would say the divide and conquer by some in this country. And this is where, I'm not a conspiracy guy, but I do believe that power and money find each other over time, and money helps to maintain power, and power wants to always stay in power, right? Those who are powerful don't want to give it up. So
you're not wrong, but what I'm saying is that is the weakness that then this money and power exploit.
Oh, that's where I'm going with it.
Because it's illogical
that
you would ever want to spend more on something and get less results. But you have
the ability to understand how to manipulate a certain base of Americans into feeling insecure that their station or their perceived position in this country is at risk. And I'm saying that very carefully. Where I'm getting at is, so, for example, we would, like you said about healthcare, right? I think if we took a time machine to 30 years ago, let's say 1994, and you were to ask Americans, hey, in 30 years, there's going to be, 600-700 mass deaths from mass shootings every year in this country. Do you think like the government would do anything or people would care about it? I'm sure most Americans, 90%, will say, yeah, I can't, there's no way that would be allowed to happen, and we don't do anything. And now here we are. And every time it's discussed, it's like pulling teeth. And so there's been documented studies on this where, for example, there's some people that just believe that they need their weapons to protect them from the other savages in their society, right? There's people that have been asked and studied that they feel like if they accept something like universal healthcare, and I'm not advocating that that's a great idea or not. I'm just saying that a lot of people don't understand why the United States, compared to other first world nations, has such a difficult time getting some of these things done. And a lot of time is because our culture and our mentality has developed around the zero-sum game. Well, if I give you this, somehow it's taken away from me and my perch on this society.
Not just that, man. So, it's not just that. Remember, this is the mentality that would lead people in primarily the South, but in other areas of the country as well. Once they were no longer allowed to keep pools segregated, they would rather fill in the pool. There's no zero-sum aspect of that. That's just, look, that is you becoming a person becoming a moral monster. Look, I would rather my kids not be able to swim than to swim in a place where it is integrated, or other kids be, even if my kids aren't going to go, I don't want it available to anyone if it's not going to be something that's segregated. So I think that's just those are the knots kind of you have to tie yourself into if you're going to say, okay, I'm going to see these human beings. Again, it's not like I'm going to see these human beings and I'm going to make it my point, though, to deny them humanity. It affects you in other ways beyond just the direct line of hate that you have there. And so I think that really is to me the biggest aspect of that. I do want to keep moving. The last piece we wanted to discuss, and it dealt with Baldwin. Now, the documentary starts. Baldwin is talking about, he's in Paris at the time, and which he had lived at various points in Europe, and talking about how he needs to come back and come back to America because of what's going on in the civil rights movement and so forth. But the way Baldwin viewed his own role, and this was something that it appeared that he struggled with a little bit, is that he wasn't an actor in the civil rights movement, but as a witness. So his job was to be there, see what was happening, and actually then present that information out, either through argument or through he wasn't a newscaster, but like explaining why this stuff matters or why this stuff is going on. And I found it to be a really interesting. Well, you and I, when we talked about this, we found it to be a really interesting kind of mindset, because part of the documentary talked about his friendship with figures like Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, and how those guys were actors, those guys were activists, but Baldwin, while he could be right there with them, that wasn't his role, but one as a witness, and so. What did you make of Baldwin, kind of recognizing his role in the civil rights movement as not one of a demonstrator or, an actor, so to speak, but more of a witness? And, I guess the tie into that is that we're talking about a documentary now that is based on his writings that, gets into the civil rights movement and the struggles America has with this issue.
Yeah, no, it's good reminder of that period of time, and And again, how vast our country is, right? When it shows him going down to Mississippi, I mean, it's like a whole different world than the world he knows in Harlem, right?
Yeah, he grew up in Harlem.
Two dynamically different worlds. However, it speaks to, like I mentioned earlier in the discussion, again, a lot of history that we don't speak in America, right? Like, most Black Americans originate from the South somewhere. So James Baldwin was no different. He's born in Harlem, but his father migrated from the Deep South in 1919 during the Great Migration to escape the terrorism from, the pushback against the successes of Reconstruction in the prior generation. So again, you can't really get into American history without understanding these periods of time that led to such change and, and get us where we are today. I had a fun little joke that I realized while I was prepping, because during the civil rights era, the three main figures that are followed, that James Baldwin also had some sort of personal connection with, was Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. And I realized they all start with M. So that's my conspiracy theory. There's a company in the Dow Jones called 3M. Think about that.
3M? Oh,
and then okay. I wanted to see, and check this out. The letter Q is 9 letters away from Z. And my wife's name starts with a Z. And 3 times 3 is 9. Man, I'm you don't think, oh, that's a different show?
I'm with you, man. This is probably great for the algorithm, right?
Yeah. I didn't think of that one, but yeah.
Yeah.
I just got to say QQQ enough and the algorithm will get it. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I'll start with the letters.
Oh, hold on. I just said QQQ is the famous NASDAQ 100 index. So, all right, we're about to go in a whole nother direction. So anyway, but
I was going to give you a lot of space with it, man. Because I think crazy like a fox.
No, that was just crazy. There was no fox in there. That was just a stupid joke that went a little too far. But no, on a serious note, so the documentary did focus on some interesting things. I mean, one was that, again, like you said earlier about if a Black man says, give me liberty or give me death, whether literally or figuratively, James Baldwin is seen today. There are those that can credibly argue that he might have been the greatest intellectual laureate and literary kind of guy in the second half of the 20th century in the United States, and compare him to Hemingway and people like that. But because he was sympathetic to the civil rights movement, had friends like Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King, and was an eloquent writer that traveled around Europe advocating for civil rights and equality in the United States, he was seen as a threat by our deep state, right? The real one, the J. Edgar Hoover FBI. Yeah. And I remember I wrote down something that the FBI had a file on him, and they considered him a dangerous individual, and his name was added to the security index. And what was interesting, and one of the reasons why they considered him dangerous, was because he was a writer. So he was eloquent. And the fact that he had frequented Europe. And again, it goes back to the mindset of any authoritarian, that once there's somebody in that they feel that should be under their control, that might have escaped the barn, so to speak, and has seen something else, that becomes a huge threat. Because the fact that Baldwin had been to Paris and Switzerland and all these countries, what they understood is he's being exposed to the way that the world could be over here, that there's that those countries aren't segregated like we are, and this and that.
And the world didn't end, and people are just fine.
And so they actually use the power of the state. I mean, this is why, again, some of these arguments today are so, just offensive, to be honest with you, when you hear them about how the state is being weaponized because some company is asking someone not to be a bigot, and the people cry about freedom of speech. This is an example of a man, along with the other three M's we mentioned, Martin, Medgar, Malcolm, who were targeted by their government and by the intelligence apparatus. And at the end of the day, it's unfortunate because 3 out of those 4 men were assassinated in that decade.
All before they reached the age of 40, which is that
progress was still not stopped. And so that's why it's sad that we have this energy that continues to creep up in our country that, in my opinion, holds us back from getting over this. That there's people that
it doesn't want to get over this. It wants to relitigate this, is what it seems like. And I mean, just real quick to comment, because you mentioned the deep state, and I think this gets confused a lot. That really was a deep state, because what J. Edgar Hoover and what the FBI was doing was not what people call out as the deep state today. Is actually what they're calling out there is people who have loyalty to the Constitution above any man or party, which is actually what we want. We want our government officials, they take an oath. We want them to be loyal to the Constitution, not to a man or to a political party. So that's actually, if that is what people are calling a deep state, which again, that's how it's being used right now, that's actually a positive. We don't want them putting their loyalties to men above the loyalty to the Constitution. But what we're talking about here, when you're talking about a real deep state in the 1960s and what J. Edgar Hoover was doing, he wasn't serving the Constitution then. He was going well beyond the law to do things what he thought was necessary in order to preserve the existing status quo, the existing hierarchical order. And so that's a deep state because, as you point out, he's using the power of the government, not because someone is in violation of the Constitution. The Constitution says you have the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. But in order to, because they're trying to fight for that constitutional right, he then uses the power of the government to try to put them down. So that's a deep state. And from a negative connotation, a deep state is, from a negative connotation, is not, oh, I'm loyal to the Constitution. Again, that's how all of our government officials should be. That's the oath they take. But getting to Baldwin, I think it's important to recognize, I think it's important that he recognized his role as an intellectual. And someone who, like, his job, while he was, and he talked about how the line between a witness and an actor is a thin one in many respects. When he's riding around in the cars with, whether it be, with Medgar Evers through the South, or with, when he's, at whatever, event, and, but his job is to observe, not necessarily to be on the front line. But his job was then to experience that stuff, to see it, to contemplate on it, to then write about it. Again, this documentary is based on his writings, but also even in contemporary times. And there's footage in the film going on talk shows and actually articulating what's happening, because we talk about, all this stuff we talk about, it's not all of white America that's on one side and then all of black America on the other side. There are many Americans who support, or at least aren't opposed to, the idea of equality. But what needs to happen a lot of times is that those Americans who either support or aren't opposed to equality, oftentimes it's hard to get them off the couch. They'll sit on the sidelines, because the Americans that are really for segregation or for a hierarchical order, those people are motivated. They stay motivated all the time. They're out with their signs saying, no race mixing, and they're out. They're not just sitting on the couch. So part of the job of the witness, of the intellectual, is, and the news media played a role in this in the 60s, once they started putting video cameras on to what was happening, and is to show all of the Americans who are okay with equality, but sitting on the couch, that aren't, up in arms trying to make the reality happen, to show them what's happening so that public sentiment can be changed towards, like, well, hold on, why are we turning fire hoses on kids or sicking dogs on these people who are trying to vote, And so I think that him recognizing his role in that was very important and something that we bear fruit from today. Because again, we're now able to look back at history and say, okay, well, here's what was going on, and here's what an intellectual's point of view was in something like this, and some of the insightful things that he brought to us. And further, then we can further that and say, okay, well, here's our thoughts on this, or other people can the next generation and the generation after that can digest it and continue the kind of the intellectual approach, and then also the demonstrative approach to bring the country towards what it says in its founding documents, at least, that it wants to be.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because as a witness, they pointed out in the documentary that he was not a member of the NAACP, he wasn't a member of SNCC, he wasn't a member of the Nation of Islam, he wasn't a member of the Black Panthers. So he was really a literary commentator of his time. So the fact he didn't commit himself, let's just say it that way. It's interesting. It's kind of like in the 48 laws, the last law is formlessness, and try to not, just try and be formless and move through all these different, parts of our reality and our culture. And I think he did a good job of behaving that way. And I think that helped him maintain that kind of witness status, that he could really observe all these different goings on, because you make a good point that, obviously white Americans aren't all a monolith, Black Americans aren't. So even the groups I named, look at how different the NAACP was to the Nation of Islam, to the Black Panther Party. Yeah. Just different makeup of people and how they thought, that whatever ideas they thought were that they wanted to support in dealing with the civil rights and that era. But then there's another that comes out as and we've had this conversation. I want to throw it back to you for your thoughts, which in terms of being the witness, the importance of technology, because the importance of images, I think, for all of us as humans. I mean, just like we've done conversations where, the border is in crisis right now as we speak in early 2024. But there's been images of people crossing the border, even when the numbers were much less 10 years ago, that had many Americans on edge. And so images are important. And so one of the great things I feel the documentary did was give us images from the civil rights era, the protests, the marches, then fast forward that to like what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, back in the last decade, and images from the way the police appeared, the way the crowd appeared. And you really can see that obviously a lot has changed, but there's a lot that hasn't changed as well since in those decades in between. And so that's what I wanted to have, throw it back to you to speak on, is what do you think the influence of things like the television in the 1960s did to not only allow Baldwin to be a bigger witness, because I know he did go down to Mississippi and he was involved, but also for the rest of the country to be a witness to what's going on down there.
It corroborated it. And then, as you said, visually is more powerful. So he could go on to all the talk shows in the world and say, hey, here's what's happening. Here's what, here's the problem, yada, yada, yada. But without a visual component to that, it's just going to be limited in terms of people's imaginations. It's going to be hard for them to believe, if they live a good life and they don't see this stuff happening, that it actually is, and that change may be needed in terms of how we're approaching things. So I think the television was very important about corroborating this, but it's also still helpful for us to this day. Like when I watch the documentary, the images affect me. When I see, for example, the school kids that are being led by federal troops to go to school, and all of the people, the mob outside that's, spitting on them and trying to intimidate these little kids and stop them from going to school. It's like, there is an element here that, and this element still exists, that will violently oppose the move of the country in a direction that they don't want. And we, like I said, like you pointed out, January 6th, like we've seen, there is an element that say, hey, violence is the answer for this. And so seeing those images, on one hand, it's like, okay, well, this is the country. This is part of the country. And when you have a open society, so to speak, you can't say, okay, well, these elements will just be gone. But it also does remind me that at that time, it was the power of the federal government that was saying, no, this is what's going to happen. And these places went into the troops, and they were ordered into places in the South to actually push this stuff through. And so on one hand, it can be shocking to be like, man, this is this is crazy that people had to live through this and had to go through this. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, but there is someone there that is pushing this along, someone that the establishment, so to speak, at that time is pushing that along. So the images and the way media was able to capture live video starting at that time helped inform the time for the people at that time, but it also helps inform us to this day.
This is also, the documentary does a great job, if you watch it closely for this, explaining without intentionally doing it, even the cultural wars we see today. This is when a lot of Americans in the South especially began to have hostility more so to the federal government, because they looked at the federal government as an outsider coming in, telling them how to live their life and run their way, their culture. And again, I appreciate everyone's culture is important and all that, but they are upset because they were forced to stop oppressing people. And I think that's different than when you look at, let's say the energy of those who feel that they've been oppressed. And like you said, saying, give me liberty or give me death, and I just think that that's something, again, we haven't recognized in this country. These people don't like the federal government because the federal government tried to enforce the Constitution. And like you said, the 15th Amendment to allow all Americans to vote. And that's intimidating for some people, just like a pop star today in 2024 intimidates enough people that it becomes a political thing because she told people to go vote. So it's I think that, I think that's an excellent point. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, tying back into earlier in the conversation, and that is just we've kicked it around, or it's come up, mentioned kind of in passing a couple times in terms of the effort that we see right now to kind of prevent the teaching of the past, of parts of the past that people may consider that they don't want to, whatever they consider, and they don't want their kids learning about it. They're going to make their kids feel ashamed and so forth. And in the context of the idea of denying humanity turns someone into a moral monster, that makes a little bit more sense if you think about it from that standpoint, because if you learn that your ancestors were moral monsters, then that may make you feel a certain way. Now, that's not necessarily a reason to not learn that, because America is a country of different perspectives. And so you can't limit the perspective. Limiting perspective usually is harmful, in any respects. If you limit your perspective when you're driving, you only can look at 3 angles instead of 4. That's unsafe driving. Limiting perspective is not necessarily a good way to go through your life. And the idea that I don't want kids learning, or different kids learning about the way previous generations denied humanity because of the way that'll make them feel, has precedent in American society. I mean, this is the Daughters of Confederacy all over. This is why there are people running around questioning why the Civil War wasn't about slavery or not. The Daughters of the Confederacy spent 50 years, 100 years after the Civil War trying to rewrite the history of the South and this history of to try to erase the idea that, as you pointed out, Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis were out there very explicit. Who were too many people actually bragging.
Yeah, they were very explicit about what the Civil War was about and why they were doing it, and it was about slavery.
They seem to be pretty proud of it. It just didn't work out.
They were. If you can find their writings today, they were very explicit that this is about slavery. This is about subjugating black people and elevating white people above them. Like they were very explicit about that. That's what the Civil War was, the Civil War was about. That's why they left.
Fascinated how people are offended by that today. Like, that's history.
But again,
if that is, be able to talk about it.
But if that is evidence of that person as a moral monster, it makes more sense, is what I'm saying. But that in alone is not a reason to hide the history, because that only harms us all, because it limits our perspective. And people talk about, your people who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Well, that's what you set yourself up for, because you would like to avoid some temporary discomfort, because part of growth, remember, is discomfort. And so you have to actually go through the discomfort piece in order to grow on the other side. And so actually the people who are trying to deny people the opportunity to learn things that might make them uncomfortable, actually what they're doing is denying them the ability to grow. So
we're screwed.
And we all are affected by that. Between
the internet, Uber Eats, DoorDash, everything else, we've got a lot of comfort.
We build it all out.
Yeah, so, but I do say, the idea of discomfort is becoming less and less palatable to most people.
No. So, but I think we can wrap from there. We'll pick up part 2 of our discussion here after this.